I'm actually really excited to share this word, and I'm not normally someone who seeks out opportunities to talk to lots of people. That's not my personality, but this message, it's a concept that's been on my heart actually for years, but just a couple months ago, I really felt like I could have a message to share here. And then just a couple weeks later, the opportunity came up for me to say, can actually share that with this congregation. So I believe God might have something to do with the timing of this, and I hope it speaks to your hearts. I would like to talk about a concept of devotion. And I think it's easy for all of us to say, I'm devoted to the Lord, right? That's actually not the version of devotion that I'm going to talk about. I'm not talking about the emotional response or affection for somebody. It's not the way that I would say I'm devoted to my husband. I want to talk about an action, an act, the verb to devote something to the Lord. So I have several examples of it. Hopefully it will all make sense, and we'll get into this. But I just want to say that in the beginning, don't misunderstand me. I'm not talking about devotion as a feeling. I'm talking about devotion as an action, okay? And instead of just going to try to define the word devotion, I want to just start out with some stories from the Bible, because stories are a better way, I think, to communicate concepts. So I have two examples I want to start with. One of them is from the Old Testament in 1 Samuel 1. There's a story of a woman named Hannah. And Hannah desperately wanted to have a child, but she had been unable to for many, many years, even though she was married. And her husband also had another wife, which was normal in that culture at that time, named Peninnah, who did have children, and she would relentlessly bully Hannah for not being able to have children. And this was very hard for her. And so one year when they were all at the temple of the Lord, and they were there for yearly sacrifices, and Hannah was being bullied by Peninnah about not being able to have children, she reached a breaking point, and she went to pray to the Lord, and she basically made a deal with him. She offered a vow to him. In 1 Samuel 1, in verse 10, it says, "In deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, 'Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head.'" And God did honor this prayer. And within the next year, she became pregnant, finally, and she had a son. And she was good to her word to the Lord when he was weaned, which might have been a couple years. She took this child that she had prayed for and longed for and loved, and she took him back to the temple, and she devoted him to the service of the Lord. She left him at the temple to serve in the temple. In verse 27, it says, "I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." And this child was the prophet Samuel, who anointed King David and served his generation and served the Lord faithfully his entire life. So that's the kind of devotion I'm talking about, the devotion of something precious to the Lord. All right, another example. Let's move to the next slide. Is the story of Mary. I'm going to read from Mark 14. This story actually appears in multiple Gospels. In John, in the telling of this story, this woman is identified as Mary, the sister of Lazarus. Lazarus being the guy that Jesus raised from the dead. So this is Mary, his sister. Even though she's not named in the story in Mark, we know from John, this is Mary. Verse 3 describes this story very simply. "A woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head." His head is Jesus. She poured this perfume on Jesus. Jesus was having dinner with some people. Mary comes in uninvited against all the cultural rules. She breaks open this precious jar of perfume and pours it on Jesus. And there's all kinds of aspects to this story that I don't have time to get into. People around the table were pretty outraged in various ways. Some of them saw this as a huge waste of money because this perfume was worth a year's salary. Just think about how much money you make in a year. Are you willing to buy a little jar of perfume with that? So some people saw this as really wasteful. Other people were just upset that she'd bothered to come in the first place as a woman and do this to Jesus at the table, very inappropriate, according to them. But the key detail in this story I wanted to talk about is that she broke the jar. This was her financial investment for her future. Only wealthy people could afford this perfume. It's made from a plant called spikenard in the Himalayas in India. This is not just available in Israel. And it had to be sealed in order to stay pure. It had to be sealed in a jar that was fused shut. So the only way to get it out is to break the jar. We have a picture of this jar. This is not the jar. This is an example of what the jar might have looked like. But this was her whole financial future, and she chose to break it open the one time it could be broken open and spend this on blessing Jesus as an act of worship. And everyone else was outraged except for Jesus. He defends her and praises her for this act. He says, "She has done a beautiful thing for me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." So this is another example of somebody taking something very precious to them and choosing to give it entirely to God as an act of worship. And in this case, she had to destroy the jar. There was nothing she could hold back for herself. She didn't take out a cork and drizzle some nice smelling perfume on him and then keep the rest, right? She gave everything. These women are showing fully surrendered devotion of something precious to the Lord. So devoting something to the Lord means giving it over to him without trying to keep anything back for yourself or control the outcome, being willing to lose it entirely if God doesn't give it back to you, and trusting him to fully know what's best for you in his kingdom. And this, when done well, is an act of worship. So that's the kind of devotion we're talking about. Not a feeling, but an action, a choice. And I want to look also at the other side of this devotion, an example of someone who did not do it well, and what the consequences of that were for him and his community. I didn't plan on choosing women who did it well and a man who didn't. That's just how it happened. I am not saying that women are better than this, or better at this than men. But there's a word in the Old Testament that actually comes up a lot, that in English is translated as devoted to the Lord. And I started noticing this years ago when I was reading through the story of the Israelites. As they're freed from Egypt, they're taken through the Red Sea, they're led and sustained through the desert for 40 years, and they're finally led to the promised land, which has been promised to these people for generations, hundreds of years, and they're finally about to take it for themselves. And the first city that they're going to take over is Jericho. Okay, I just want to give you kind of the setting here. But throughout this story, as they're taking over the promised land, I noticed that there's a footnote in my Bible every time this word devoted is used. And the footnote says, the Hebrew term refers to the irrevocable giving over of things or persons to the Lord, often by totally destroying them. Irrevocable means you can't take it back, right? If I give you something irrevocably, it means there's no chance of me getting it back. And I looked up the actual Hebrew word, and it's cherem. It implies setting apart something for the Lord, either for service, as in Samuel's case when he was a baby, or for destruction, kind of like how Mary chose to destroy her bottle of perfume in service to the Lord. Okay? So the Israelites are taking over Jericho. God gives them a very unique battle plan. That's another story for another day. The walls of Jericho fall. They take over this city. And as God was giving Joshua, the leader of the Israelites at the time, he's giving them this battle plan of how to take over this city. He tells them to devote the city to the Lord. In Joshua 6:16, Joshua communicates this to the Israelites. Joshua commanded the army, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that are in it are to be devoted to the Lord. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury. So even here we have both types of devoted things. We have things for destruction, and we have things for the service of the Lord that will go to his treasury. The point being, none of this was to be taken by individual people and used for personal gain. And verse 21 and 24 tells us that they mostly did this as they were commanded. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. They burned the city and everything in it. They put the silver and gold and the article of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord. There's a whole nother sermon on how a good and loving God could order the destruction of an entire people in a city. We're not going to go there today because there's too much there to explain. But if that's a sticking point for you and you are really bothered by that, I'd love to talk to you afterwards and just explain some of the reasons I see behind that. But that's not what we're talking about today. All right, there's this one guy named Achan. Looks like Achan or Akan. But apparently, according to Google, which is never wrong, right? According to Google, the way to say this in Hebrew is Achan. Achan took some of the plunder without permission from Jericho. And it says in verse 1 of chapter 7, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, not just Achan, but all of Israel. And as they go to try to conquer the next city, it's called Ai, they fail. It should have been an easy takeover, and the Israelites totally fail. And they're all shocked because they have come with the power of the Lord. And suddenly God did not give them the city. And so Joshua is crying out to God, and God explains in verse 11 to Joshua, Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant. Notice he says they, Israel, not Achan. They have violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen. They have lied. They have put them with their own possessions. And that is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. They turn their backs and run because they have been made liable to destruction. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction. That sounds really harsh to me. I say that. It seems like all of Israel, to 99%, followed God's instructions, and one guy got tempted and messed it up. And God's response is, I won't be with you anymore unless you fix this. He has been leading these guys out of slavery through the desert, performing amazing miracles, and this one thing could mess up the whole plan. So why is this such a big deal? I think we have a slide that talks about some of those points. Yeah, what's so bad about that? Firstly, and this again could be an entire another sermon, Jericho was the first city being taken over. It was essentially to be a tithe to the Lord. It was the first fruits of the promised land given back to God. By first fruits, I'm referring to when God gives the law to the Israelites, and it talks about providing for the priests the first of the harvest that you would get, you would give to the priests and as a devotion to God. So this is representative of a tithe to the Lord, this whole city. And Achan took some of that back for himself. And there's another aspect of this, why this is such a big deal. Achan probably had no idea, thinking about the long-term plan of what God was doing with the Israelites. But God has the long-term story of trying to protect this chosen people and guide them so that they can someday produce the Messiah to redeem the whole world. And Achan is actually from the tribe of Judah, which is the tribe that Jesus came from. So we can also see that Achan just did not understand that he was endangering the plan that God had for all of humankind, because the Israelites needed to be protected from some cultural aspects that could have really tempted them away from God. Some of these cultures were practicing ritual prostitution, infant sacrifice to foreign gods, this, trying to talk to evil spirits. Like, there were some real bad things that needed to not be passed on to the Israelites. And Achan, in his moment of temptation, I'm sure, didn't even think about that. But God could not let that corruption enter into the Israelites at this time because it could derail the whole plan. Ultimately, the reason this was such a big deal is because Achan disobeyed God. God had told him to do one thing, and he decided to do something else. And the root of this is pride. To make it really simple, when God tells you to do something and you think, I know better, that's pride. And that's actually the same sin that got Adam and Eve thrown out of the garden in the first place, right? This is the root of the entire fall of mankind. God tells us to do something, and when we're tempted, we think, I know better. So this is really a big deal. This is not a small sin that Achan has performed, okay? God's favor was not with the Israelites again until this sin was uncovered, confessed. Achan was killed for this, and the stolen items had to be restored to either devotion or destruction, where they were supposed to be in the first place. And then God's presence was with them again, and they went back to that same city, and they conquered it. And a great sad irony to this story is that in that next city that they conquered, they were allowed to keep the plunder for themselves. In Joshua 8, 1-2, the instructions this time to Joshua are, "You shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king, except that you may carry off the plunder and livestock for yourselves." Jericho is the first fruits and the tithe. Everything was given to the Lord. But after that, in their journey, they were often allowed to keep the plunder of the cities to benefit themselves. So if Achan had just waited literally a few more days, he would have been able to keep some of that plunder for himself that he had wanted. But it would have been given with blessing from the Lord and not obtained through disobedience with guilt and secrecy. God is not greedy. He doesn't want our stuff. He doesn't need our stuff. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. And he doesn't want to keep good things from us. But he sees the bigger plan, and we need to trust that he knows what's good for us and when it's good for us. Okay, thanks for listening to all the stories. I know it's a lot of information. We heard about Hannah devoting her son to the Lord's service. We heard about Mary breaking her precious jar of perfume to bless Jesus as an act of wholehearted worship, holding nothing back for herself. And we've heard about Achan not honoring a command to devote things to the Lord and the trouble that brought him and his whole community. When God asks us to give something of ours to him, or if we choose to give something to him as an offering, the degree to which we fully let go and leave that in his hands shows how much we trust God to truly be the director of our lives. Do you trust him to decide if something should be removed and destroyed from your life, or made holy and used only for his service? When we say, as I think people can easily do in Christian culture, that our lives or our families or our talents are devoted to the Lord, how much are we still trying to control those things ourselves after we decide that's what we want to do with them? And this isn't something that we just become perfect at right away. I want to acknowledge that. I've been a Christian for almost 22 years, and I'm still learning this lesson. But as we grow in our faith, we should be intentionally developing a habit of regularly devoting precious things in our lives to the Lord and seeing what he does with them. Should this thing or job or relationship be a part of our life at all? Is it useful to the kingdom? And we're certainly allowed to use our own brains and intelligence, but ultimately we need to trust God to be our provider and our regulator of what is right, what is wrong, and what is good for us. When we devote something in our lives to him and he gives it back to us, we can trust that he wants it in our lives. If he takes it away from us completely, we need to let him, and that's really hard to do sometimes. As we encounter difficult or significant situations, it is important to be intentionally surrendering the outcomes to God and trusting him for what is best. All right, I have one more story to share with you, and this time it's from my own life, about how this could look in modern day life? What does this actually look like for us today? Because we are no longer in a culture or a time period where we're running around with swords looking for people and things to devote to the Lord through destruction, right? Please don't do that. That is not how you can honor God in this day and age. So how do we cultivate a heart like Mary had or like Hannah had? I actually have multiple examples in my life I could share with you about this. But the one I'm going to share is about the chance I had to devote to the Lord the decision of who I marry, which is a big choice in life, obviously. So this is my story of how that happened. So you guys, most of you, I think, know I'm married to Joshua. He's also part of this church. So he's here. We're good. Just want to throw that out there. He knows this story too. Before I met Joshua, there was a young man that I had really liked for a couple of years, and I really wanted to marry him. We just connected in a way I've never connected with anyone else, and it seemed like we were a really good fit. It took a couple years for him to decide he wanted to pursue me back. So I kind of waited for him, and finally he approached me and said, God's been talking to me about you. He's shown me your value. I would like to pursue you and see where this goes. And so we started dating, and then shortly afterwards, just a couple months in, he told me he wanted to marry me. He was saving for an engagement ring. I was so excited. It was finally my turn, right? He was well known and liked in our church, and our community agreed we were a good match. And then just before he was planning to propose to me, some deeper issues in his life and his past and his habits started coming up. And we knew that we needed to get these addressed and figured out before we got married. But he really struggled to take the time or the effort to address the problems. And then he started doubting that he could be a good husband. And then he started doubting that the Word of God could be trusted. And he just kind of spiraled down and ended up having a full-blown personal and faith crisis, to the point that if this is the state he had been in the first place, I wouldn't have started dating him. But we were already many months in and had plans and dreams, and this was really, really hard for me. I was in emotional turmoil for months, waiting for him to figure himself out, trying to be strong and patient, and I had wanted to marry him for years. And then he finally pursued me and said he wanted to marry me back, and I really thought this is what God had for me because it just made sense in the beginning. So I wasn't going to let it go. I wasn't just going to give up. That seemed like the wrong thing, right? You're supposed to be strong in your faith and trust in the Lord and wait for the Lord. And I really held on to this, even though I knew God was asking me to let go of the control of the outcome of this. But I did everything in my power to convince this guy that we should still get married despite his struggles, which is not a good idea, by the way. I prayed for him and for us, and I begged God to straighten him out. And I tried really, really hard to make it work. But in my own knowledge and my own skills, I could not control him, and I could not fix his problems for him. And I made my life miserable, trying to control something that wasn't mine to control. It affected my physical health. I had heart palpitations, and they got worse. I had to go see a doctor. I was nauseous and anxious all the time. I was on the verge of tears all the time for months, and I was really suffering. And I finally admitted that I could not sustain this state that I was in, and I surrendered the situation to God. I still really wanted to marry him, and I told God that I would accept the direction he chose for us, and even to the point that if it came between choosing a path God said was mine, if that was different than pursuing this guy in this life and this marriage that I wanted, that I would choose God's path. I essentially put my entire future on God's altar. And I told him he could take it away from me if he wanted to. And it was way harder than I thought it would be. I'd been a Christian for 14 years at this point. And it had never occurred to me before this that it would be hard to choose God over anything else. But it was hard. And then God accepted my offer and took it away from me. He told me, in one of the few times I've heard a direct word from the Lord in words, In my head, he said, break up. And to be honest, my first reaction was, no, I can't. It wasn't a defiant no, it was just, I can't. Even after I decided to surrender if he asked me to, I didn't think I could survive losing that future and starting over again alone. But I'm also stubborn in my own way, and I was determined to do the right thing and choose God's path. So I started with what I could do, and I asked God to help my heart get to a place where I could obey. And it took me a month, 1 month, to finally be able to tell this guy that I couldn't wait for him any longer, and I needed to move on. And we broke up and went our separate ways. And then everything was wonderful, right? No, I was shattered. I was really in pain. I cried all the time for weeks. You guys ever been through a season where you cry so much that your face is always swollen and it just hurts all the time? Yeah, this was me for like weeks. I really grieved hard. But I also had that deeper peace come back because I had chosen God's way. And I knew I would be okay again someday. I just kind of had to write it out. In hindsight, it was a really good thing I didn't marry this guy. He's a great guy. I still know him. He's back on track with the Lord. He just got married in January. It's awesome. So, I'm thrilled for his story. We would not have done well together. He was not a good match for me. And that's hard to see in the moment when you're in love with somebody, right? But God knows better. And I'm really glad he rescued me from that, because it would have either been a very difficult marriage or a failed marriage. And God being good, I actually met Joshua very quickly after this relationship failed. And within a year, we were married. And Joshua is a much, much better match for me. We've been married almost 7 years, and he's wonderful. And our marriage is still able to be devoted to the Lord, but this time it is for service and not for destruction. So God knew what I needed, despite what I wanted, and he gave me something much better instead. I've always loved this. I've seen this on Facebook, online for years. This idea that how can you give up the thing that you love, but you have no idea what God has for you instead. So at first, I was more like Achan and not good at giving up what I wanted to the Lord. And it caused me a lot of pain and mess. I didn't walk this out well because I didn't want to let go until I didn't have the strength anymore. But when I finally let it go, God was able to heal me pretty quickly, oddly enough. He removed from my life what was dangerous to me, and he gave me what I actually needed. And just as a fun thought experiment, realize my family and I would not be able to be here in Croatia with all of you if I hadn't made that choice to follow God's path instead of the one that I wanted. So it's really cool to see how things work out when you trust God. Okay. So to devote something to the Lord is really about trust and surrender. Trust exists in your heart and your mind, and it can be very genuine there. But surrender in real life situations and choices is what turns that trust into action. A very well-known verse, Proverbs 3:5-6, really captures this well. It says, "Trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to take." And it really comes down to humility, which is very fitting because we discovered that the root of Achan's sin was pride. So the opposite in trust and surrender is humility. When we understand and deeply accept that we do not know better than God, we actually begin to want the outcomes based on his decisions and his choices more than we want the outcomes of what we think we want. Achan didn't do this well, and it cost him his life, and it brought great harm to his community for a season. Mary did do this well, and she was able to bless Jesus before he faced the cross. And she is now remembered in the Bible for all generations to learn from her example. That's a huge honor. And Hannah also did this well, and Israel was blessed with a trustworthy, devoted prophet and servant who served the Lord his whole life and brought in the reign of King David. And I finally did this well after not doing it well. It's nice that this one did not cost me my life like it did Achan. I was given a second chance. And I received a better husband than I ever thought would be available to me because of that choice. So how do we actually start to develop this in our own lives? If this is kind of a new concept of having to be so intentional about surrendering things to God, where do we start? A good place to start is just to pray and ask God to show you areas in your life where you don't actually trust him to have full control. You're probably not even aware of this totally. But I keep finding areas of my life that I'm still trying to control, which when I think about it means I don't actually trust God to handle this without me. Pride, right? So here's some examples of places we might not trust the Lord. And this is challenging to me, all of these. How about finances? Do you guys tithe? Do you trust him to provide for your needs when you obey him, as he promises in his word in Malachi 3:10? Or do you secretly think that your situation's just a little different? You might be an exception. You really should be the one to choose when you tithe and how much money you make. And how about your health? When when the doctor tells you that something's wrong in your body, do you assume that you know that the best outcome is to be immediately healed and demand that God fulfills your desire to be healed? Or do you ask him what he wants to do with you through the situation, even if that answer is that he's going to use you mightily for his kingdom by you going through a difficult sickness? How about your job? Are you always looking for a job that makes you the most comfortable or makes you the most money? Or are you willing to ask God what position you should be in to reach people in difficult places? And as it was for me, relationships are a big one too. Are you willing to let people out of your life if God chooses to remove them? Or are you willing to let God introduce you to difficult people that he wants to be around you, even if you don't enjoy their presence very much? It's been a theme in my life sometimes. And I cannot tell you what these areas are for you. That is only for God to identify. That's between you guys. But if he does show you an area like this, a great next step is to simply ask for help surrendering it. And remember, when we're praying about things like this, we need to be listening as much as we're talking. Because otherwise, how are we going to hear the answer? And I do want to just clarify as a side note that I'm not saying that we throw up our hands and never make our own decisions again, okay? God gave us brains and minds on purpose. And he tells us to ask for wisdom so that we can use wisdom in daily life, okay? We are not blind, mindless followers because God doesn't want robot slaves. He wants children in relationship. But when we choose to surrender the outcome of things in our life to God and trust that he knows better than we do, with our jobs and our families and our possessions and our bodies and our lives, that's when God can work out his perfect will through our lives. He declutters us from things that are not what he has for us, and we can become powerful agents for the Lord, and we stop getting in his way. We start really studying the Word of God, not because it's what a good Christian is supposed to do, but because we actually want to know and understand God's heart and his decisions. We start really praying to listen for God's direction because we want to know what he's asking of us, not just using prayer to tell him what we want. And Roz, you can come up if you want. So this morning, as we have prayer at the end of service, as we always do, some of us will be up here to pray with you if you feel you have a prayer need. But I specifically want to challenge you to think if you have anything in your life that you think God is asking you to surrender to him, that you would like prayer for. If it's something that may need to be removed from your life, or if it's something that may need to be devoted for service to the Lord, if you're willing to ask him if there's something in your life that fits into this category, please come up for prayer and we will help you pray. And we will listen with you for the Lord's response. But I encourage you from personal experience to let go of things into God's hands and see what he does, because the outcome is always greater than the outcome that you were wanting in the first place. God's ways are better than our ways.